The investors from Marseille are very traditional, Philippe explained rapidly. They expect certain protocols. Jean-Claude will explain the cultural nuances to you later. But when Margaret approached Jean-Claude afterward, his explanation was filled with French terms for business customs she'd never heard of. She found herself nodding and taking notes while understanding maybe half of what he was telling her. The translation apps became her constant companions, but they were useless when Philippe and Jean-Claude spoke at their normal pace. She'd try to discreetly type phrases into her phone, but by the time the app processed the words, the conversation had moved on to 3 different topics. Margaret started avoiding direct interactions with both men whenever possible. She'd send emails instead of having face-to-face conversations, claiming she wanted to keep written records of their requests. She began relying heavily on the other staff members, hoping they might catch details she'd missed. But the strategy backfired during the second week of Jean-Claude's stay. Philippe called an impromptu meeting about an urgent investor dinner for the following evening. As he rapidly outlined the requirements in a mixture of English and French, Margaret realized she was completely lost. The Bordeaux selection needs to be impeccable, Philippe said, switching to rapid French to explain something to Jean-Claude about regional wine preferences. Margaret, you understand about the Chateau Margaux we discussed? And make sure Antoine knows about the vegetarian options for Madame Petit. Margaret nodded confidently, but she had no idea what they'd discussed about Chateau Margaux, and she wasn't even sure she'd heard the guest's name correctly. She spent the rest of the day frantically trying to piece together the requirements from her incomplete notes. The dinner was a near disaster. The wine selection was wrong, the vegetarian options weren't prepared correctly, and she'd completely misunderstood the dress code Philippe had mentioned. The investors were gracious, but Margaret could see Philippe's frustration growing throughout the evening. After the guests left, Philippe asked to speak with her privately in his office. Margaret's stomach churned as she sat across from his imposing desk, surrounded by awards and photographs of his business achievements. Margaret, I'm concerned, Philippe said gently. Tonight had several issues that could have been avoided with better communication. I'm wondering if there's something we need to address. Margaret's pride battled with her desperation. She could admit her language limitations and risk looking incompetent, or she could try to deflect and hope things improved. Unfortunately, her pride won. I think there might have been some confusion with the vendors, she said carefully. I'll follow up tomorrow to make sure our instructions were clear on their end. Philippe looked unconvinced but didn't push the issue. Very well. But moving forward, I need to be confident that when I give instructions, they're being understood and executed exactly as I specify. The situation got worse the following week when Philippe received an unexpected call that sent him into a panic. His elderly mother had decided to fly in from Paris for an extended visit, and she'd be arriving in just 3 days. Maman doesn't speak English, Philippe explained, switching rapidly between French and English as he outlined the preparations needed. She'll need a full social calendar, shopping excursions in San Francisco, appointments with her doctor in the city, and she wants to host a dinner party for some French expatriates in the area. Margaret scribbled notes frantically, but Philippe was speaking so quickly and emotionally that she could barely keep up. He was stressed about his mother's visit, and stress made his English nearly disappear entirely. Elle is très particular about her routines, Philippe continued. Every morning, café au lait at exactly 8:30. Then she reads Le Figaro online. She likes to walk in the gardens, but only when the sun isn't too strong. For lunch, she prefers light meals, jamais anything too heavy. And in the evenings, she enjoys classical music, maybe some Chopin or Debussy. Margaret caught maybe half of the requirements, but she was too afraid to keep asking for clarification. Philippe seemed to assume she understood everything perfectly, and she didn't want to disappoint him again so soon after the dinner party problems. When Madame Dubois arrived, Margaret realized she was in serious trouble. Philippe's mother was an elegant woman in her 70s, with sharp eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to having things done correctly. She spoke no English whatsoever, and seemed surprised when Margaret couldn't respond to her polite French greetings. The first morning was a comedy of errors. Margaret had prepared coffee instead of café au lait, not understanding the distinction. When Madame Dubois asked about the newspaper in rapid French, Margaret could only smile helplessly and nod. The walking schedule was completely wrong because Margaret had misunderstood Philippe's instructions about timing and sun exposure. By the third day, Margaret was having panic attacks. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, her mind racing with French phrases she couldn't decode and responsibilities she couldn't fulfill. She started making excuses to avoid interacting with Madame Dubois directly. But the elderly woman was sharp enough to notice that something was wrong. During a particularly stressful afternoon, Margaret was trying to coordinate a shopping trip to San Francisco, while simultaneously planning the dinner party for Madame Dubois' friends. She had pages of notes in Philippe's rapid French that she couldn't fully translate, and she was making educated guesses about everything from transportation to guest preferences. She was sitting in her office, surrounded by French dictionaries and translation printouts, when she heard voices in the hallway. Madame Dubois was speaking to someone in fluent, elegant French, and another voice was responding with equal fluency and sophistication. Margaret looked up in surprise. She recognized the second voice, but it couldn't be who she thought it was. She crept to her doorway and peered out, and what she saw made her question everything she thought she knew about her own staff. Isabella, the quiet housekeeper who usually communicated in simple English phrases, was having an animated conversation with Madame Dubois about French literature. Not only was Isabella speaking perfect French, but she was discussing authors and cultural references with the kind of knowledge that suggested deep familiarity with French culture. Margaret stood frozen in her doorway, watching the woman she'd barely noticed demonstrate the exact skills she desperately needed. Isabella was everything Margaret pretended to be, natural and confident in French conversation, and she'd been right there the entire time. For the first time since taking the job, Margaret realized that her biggest problem might not be the language barrier itself, but her pride in admitting she needed help. As she watched Isabella effortlessly solve a scheduling conflict that had been driving Margaret crazy for hours, she began to wonder if swallowing her pride might be the key to saving her dream job. Margaret spent the rest of that afternoon watching Isabella from a distance, trying to process what she'd witnessed. The woman she'd barely noticed for 3 weeks was speaking French like she'd been born in Paris. Every interaction between Isabella and Madame Dubois flowed effortlessly, filled with laughter and understanding that Margaret couldn't achieve even with her translation apps. The next morning, Margaret's curiosity got the better of her. She found Isabella in the laundry room, quietly folding Philippe's business shirts with the same methodical care she brought to everything. "Isabella," Margaret said carefully, "I couldn't help but notice you speaking French with Madame Dubois yesterday. Your pronunciation is incredible. Where did you learn to speak so well?" Isabella looked up, and for the first time since Margaret had met her, she seemed genuinely surprised. "Oh, you heard that?" she said, a slight flush creeping up her cheeks. "I didn't mean to overstep. Madame Dubois seemed confused about something, and I just wanted to help." "Overstep?" Margaret shook her head. "Isabella, you speak better French than anyone I've ever met. How long have you been fluent?" Isabella set down the shirt she was folding and really looked at Margaret for the first time. "My mother is French," she said quietly. "From Toulouse. My father is Spanish, from Barcelona. I grew up speaking all 3 languages at home." Margaret felt her jaw drop. "3 languages?" "French, Spanish, and English," Isabella confirmed. "I studied international relations at the Sorbonne in Paris before I moved here. I actually lived in France for 6 years before my visa situation got complicated." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Isabella had been educated at one of France's most prestigious universities. She had the exact qualifications and cultural knowledge that Margaret desperately needed. And she'd been working as a housekeeper because of immigration issues, not lack of ability. "Isabella," Margaret said slowly, "can I ask you something? Have you noticed me struggling with French conversations around here?" Isabella hesitated, clearly not wanting to embarrass her boss. "I've seen you working very hard," she said diplomatically. "The translation apps on your phone, the French dictionaries in your office. You're really trying to learn." Margaret felt a mix of mortification and relief. Her struggles hadn't been as invisible as she'd hoped, but Isabella had been kind enough not to interfere or make her feel worse about it. "The truth is," Margaret admitted, "I'm in way over my head. I can barely understand half of what Philippe says when he gets excited. And with Jean-Claude here and now his mother, I feel like I'm failing at the most basic parts of my job." Isabella's expression softened with understanding. "Language barriers are difficult," she said gently, "especially when you're trying to manage complex situations. Philippe speaks very quickly, and he uses a lot of regional expressions from his childhood. Even native speakers sometimes have trouble keeping up with him when he's passionate about something. That afternoon, Margaret witnessed another display of Isabella's abilities that left her even more impressed. Madame Dubois had been trying to explain something about a dinner party she wanted to host, and Margaret had been struggling to understand the requirements despite 40 minutes of attempted conversation. Margaret had gathered that Madame Dubois wanted to invite French expatriates living in the Bay Area, but the details about food preferences, cultural protocols, and guest list requirements were lost in translation. She'd been about to give up and try to wing it when Isabella appeared. "Pardonnez-moi, Madame Dubois," Isabella said politely. "Perhaps I could help clarify some details for Margaret." What followed was 15 minutes of rapid, sophisticated French conversation that solved every confusion Margaret had been wrestling with. But more than that, Isabella didn't just translate. She added cultural context that Margaret never would have considered. Madame Dubois wants to recreate the atmosphere of a traditional Parisian salon, Isabella explained to Margaret afterward. That means specific wines from particular regions, certain types of cheese served at precise temperatures, and conversation areas arranged to encourage intellectual discussion. "She's not just planning a dinner party, she's creating a cultural experience," Isabella continued. She mentioned that Monsieur Beaumont, one of the guests, is a wine collector who will expect to discuss the terroir of whatever you serve. Madame Laurent is a retired literature professor who might appreciate some French poetry books displayed casually. These details matter to this group. Margaret stared at Isabella in amazement. "How do you know all that?" "Cultural context," Isabella said simply. "When you understand the deeper meaning behind requests, everything becomes clearer. Madame Dubois isn't just asking for food and wine. She's asking for a piece of home." Over the next few days, Margaret began paying closer attention to Isabella's interactions with the French speakers in the house. She noticed that Philippe's whole demeanor changed when he spoke with Isabella. His shoulders relaxed, his voice became more animated, and he seemed genuinely happy to have someone who understood not just his words, but his cultural references. During a business call with investors in France, Philippe was struggling to explain a complex technical concept in English for Jean-Claude to translate. Margaret watched as Isabella discreetly handed Philippe a piece of paper with the exact English terminology he needed, allowing the conversation to flow smoothly. "Where did that come from?" Margaret asked Isabella later. "My degree focused on renewable energy policy," Isabella explained. "I wrote my thesis on solar panel adoption rates across European markets. I understand the technical vocabulary in both languages." Margaret felt like she'd discovered a hidden treasure in her own house. Isabella wasn't just trilingual. She was educated in exactly the field Philippe worked in. She understood business, culture, and technology in ways that made her invaluable for Philippe's international operations. The real moment of truth came when Madame Dubois had a medical concern. She'd been feeling dizzy during her morning walks, and she wanted to see a doctor who spoke French. Margaret had been frantically calling medical offices in San Francisco, trying to find someone who could accommodate the language requirement. Isabella volunteered to help make the calls. Within an hour, she'd not only found a French-speaking doctor, but had also researched the physician's background, confirmed his specialty in geriatric care, and arranged for a car service that employed a driver who spoke French. "How did you manage all that so quickly?" Margaret asked. "I know the French community here," Isabella said. "There's a network of French speakers in the Bay Area, professionals who help each other. Dr. Moreau was recommended by 3 different people I called. The car service owner is from Lyon, just like Jean-Claude. When you understand the community, you know who to ask for help." That evening, Margaret sat in her office staring at her French dictionaries and translation apps, feeling overwhelmed by how much she still didn't understand. But for the first time since taking the job, she also felt hope. Isabella had shown her that the language barrier wasn't insurmountable. More importantly, Isabella had demonstrated that there were cultural and professional dimensions to serving Philippe's family that went far beyond basic translation. Margaret realized she had a choice to make. She could continue struggling alone, pretending she had skills she didn't possess and probably failing at increasingly important tasks, or she could swallow her pride and ask for help from someone who clearly had the expertise she lacked. The question was whether her ego could handle admitting that the woman she'd barely noticed might be the key to her success in this dream job. Margaret had spent her whole career building a reputation as someone who could handle any challenge. Could she admit that this time, she needed help from someone she'd overlooked? As she watched Isabella efficiently coordinating Madame Dubois' evening routine through the window, Margaret knew what she had to do. The next morning she was going to have a conversation that might change everything about how the household operated. She just hoped Isabella would be willing to help her save the job she'd worked 15 years to get. Margaret barely slept that night. She kept rehearsing different ways to approach Isabella, trying to find words that would express her need for help without sounding desperate or incompetent. By morning, she'd decided to be completely honest. Even if it meant admitting her limitations, she found Isabella in the kitchen early, preparing Madame Dubois' morning café au lait with the precision of someone who understood that every detail mattered. Margaret took a deep breath and dove in. "Isabella, I need to ask you something important," she began, "and I need you to be completely honest with me, even if it might be uncomfortable." Isabella looked up from the coffee preparation, her expression attentive but cautious. "I'm failing at this job," Margaret continued. "Not the organizational parts or the staff management, but the communication with Philippe and his family. I thought I could handle the French requirements, but I was wrong. I'm making mistakes that could cost Philippe business relationships. And I'm making his mother's visit stressful instead of enjoyable." Isabella set down the coffee cup and gave Margaret her full attention. "I've watched you over the past week," Margaret went on, "and you have exactly the skills I lack. You don't just speak French, you understand the culture, the business terminology, the social expectations. You know things I'll never learn from a phrase book or translation app." Margaret paused, gathering her courage for the hardest part. "I want to propose something that might sound crazy. What if we worked together, not as manager and housekeeper, but as partners? I handle the operational side of estate management, and you handle all the French communication and cultural coordination." Isabella's eyes widened in surprise. "Margaret, I appreciate the thought, but I'm not sure Philippe would approve of such an arrangement. I'm here on a work visa for domestic staff. There might be legal complications." "Let me worry about the legal aspects," Margaret said. "Right now, I'm more concerned about whether you'd even want to take on that kind of responsibility. It would mean dealing with Philippe's business associates, managing complex cultural requirements, and essentially becoming my co-manager." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking through the implications. "Can I ask why you're willing to share authority? Most managers I've worked for would rather struggle alone than admit they need help." Margaret laughed, but it was a sound without humor. "Because I'm desperate," she said honestly. "And because I've realized that protecting my ego isn't worth failing at the best job I've ever had. You're clearly overqualified to be working as a housekeeper, and I'm clearly underqualified to handle the French requirements of this position. Maybe together we can actually do the job Philippe needs done." Before Isabella could respond, they heard rapid French conversation approaching the kitchen. Philippe and Jean-Claude appeared, deep in discussion about something that had them both gesturing enthusiastically. "Margaret," Philippe called out when he saw her, "we need to arrange an emergency conference call with our investors in Paris. The time difference means we need to set it up for this evening, and we'll need simultaneous translation for the American participants. Also, Maman wants to change the dinner party to tomorrow night instead of next week. Can you handle all of that?" Margaret felt her familiar panic rising, but before she could stammer out a response, Isabella stepped forward. "Monsieur Dubois," Isabella said smoothly in French, "perhaps I could assist Margaret with the coordination? I have experience with international business communications." Philippe looked surprised, as if he was really seeing Isabella for the first time. He responded in rapid French, asking about her background and qualifications. Margaret watched as Isabella calmly explained her education and experience, mentioning her degree from the Sorbonne and her familiarity with renewable energy business terminology. Jean-Claude joined the conversation, asking Isabella technical questions about European energy markets. Margaret couldn't follow the rapid French, but she could see Philippe's expression changing from curiosity to genuine interest to something approaching excitement. After 10 minutes of animated conversation, Philippe turned to Margaret. "This is remarkable," he said. "Isabella has suggested some excellent solutions for our communication challenges. She understands both the technical and cultural aspects of what we need." Philippe looked between Margaret and Isabella thoughtfully. "Margaret, Would you be open to restructuring how we handle the household's international requirements? I think Isabella could be invaluable for managing our French communications and cultural needs. Margaret felt a surge of relief and gratitude. I think that's an excellent idea, she said. Isabella has skills that would benefit the entire household operation. That afternoon, the three of them sat down for a formal discussion about how this new arrangement might work. Philippe was more enthusiastic than Margaret had expected. I've been frustrated with communication gaps, Philippe admitted. Not just with you, Margaret, but with previous staff as well. Having someone who truly understands French business culture could prevent many of the small misunderstandings that have been causing problems. Isabella proved her value immediately by suggesting solutions Margaret never would have thought of. For the conference call tonight, she said, I could prepare a technical vocabulary sheet for your American participants so they understand key terms before the call begins. And for Madame Dubois' dinner party, I know several French expatriates who could help with authentic menu planning and cultural protocols. Philippe's eyes lit up. Yes, exactly. These are the kinds of details that make the difference between adequate and exceptional. Over the next few hours, Isabella transformed chaos into organized efficiency. She coordinated the conference call with precision, preparing materials that ensured smooth communication between French and American participants. She contacted French community members who provided authentic recipes and cultural guidance for Madame Dubois' dinner party. Most importantly, she served as a bridge between Margaret's operational expertise and Philippe's cultural expectations. When Philippe requested something in rapid French, Isabella would clarify the requirements with him, then explain to Margaret not just what was needed, but why it mattered and how to execute it properly. This is how it should work, Margaret thought as she watched Isabella effortlessly manage a complex conversation between Philippe and a French supplier. I can handle the logistics, schedules, and staff coordination. Isabella can handle the cultural nuances and language requirements. Together, we're actually better than either of us could be alone. The dinner party that evening was a revelation. With Isabella's cultural guidance, every detail was perfect. The wine selection honored regional French preferences. The food reflected authentic Parisian traditions, and the conversation flowed naturally because Isabella had briefed Margaret on each guest's background and interests. Madame Dubois was delighted. Philippe was impressed, and the French expatriate guests were charmed by the attention to cultural details. After the guests left, Philippe asked to speak with Margaret and Isabella together. Tonight was exactly what I hope for when I entertain, he said. Every detail showed understanding and respect for our guests' expectations. This is the standard I want to maintain for all our events. He paused, looking thoughtful. I'd like to formalize this arrangement. Isabella, I want to offer you a promotion to assistant estate manager, with specific responsibility for French communications and cultural coordination. Margaret, you'd continue as head estate manager, but you'd work as a team for anything involving our French operations. Margaret felt a mix of relief and excitement. Instead of feeling threatened by Isabella's abilities, she felt empowered by the partnership they were building. There's one more thing, Philippe added. I'm planning to expand my operations in France over the next year. I'll need someone who can coordinate between our California and European properties. Isabella, if you're interested, this position could include opportunities to travel and manage projects in France. Isabella's face lit up with an expression Margaret had never seen before. Monsieur Dubois, I would be honored to take on these responsibilities. As they shook hands on the new arrangement, Margaret realized something important had happened. She'd stopped seeing Isabella's abilities as a threat to her own position, and started seeing them as the key to everyone's success. For the first time since taking the job, Margaret felt like she might actually be able to build the career she'd always dreamed of, not by pretending to have skills she lacked, but by finding the right people to complement her strengths. The next morning, Margaret woke up without the knot of anxiety that had been her constant companion for weeks. Instead, she felt excited about the challenges ahead, knowing she finally had a partner who could help her meet them. 3 months after Isabella's promotion, the Dubois estate was running like a precision instrument. Margaret and Isabella had developed a partnership that seemed almost telepathic in its efficiency. Margaret handled scheduling, vendor management, and staff coordination, while Isabella managed all French communications, cultural requirements, and international business support. The transformation was remarkable. Philippe's stress levels dropped noticeably when he could communicate complex instructions in his native language and trust that they'd be understood perfectly. Jean-Claude's extended stay had turned into a permanent relocation to California, largely because he was so impressed with the seamless support he received at the estate. Madame Dubois had extended her visit twice, charmed by Isabella's ability to recreate the cultural comforts of home, while introducing her to the best of California's offerings. She'd taken to calling Isabella ma chère petite fille, treating her like a beloved granddaughter. But the real test of their partnership came when Philippe announced his biggest challenge yet. "I'm hosting the European Renewable Energy Summit here next month," Philippe told them during their weekly planning meeting. 50 executives from 12 countries, including energy ministers from France, Germany, and Spain. "We'll have 3 days of presentations, formal dinners, and cultural events. This needs to be flawless." Margaret felt the familiar flutter of anxiety, but this time it was excitement rather than panic. A year ago, an event of this magnitude would have terrified her. Now, with Isabella as her partner, she felt confident they could handle anything. "We'll need simultaneous translation for all the technical sessions," Isabella noted, already thinking through the logistics and cultural considerations for the evening events. "The French delegation will expect different protocols than the German group, and the Spanish representatives have specific dietary requirements." Margaret pulled out her planning notebooks. "I'll handle venue setup, accommodation coordination, and staff scheduling. Isabella, can you manage the cultural protocols and language requirements?" "Absolutely. I'll also prepare cultural briefing materials for our American staff, so everyone understands the different expectations and communication styles." Over the next month, Margaret watched Isabella coordinate details that would have been impossible for her to manage alone. Isabella arranged for professional translators who specialized in energy terminology, researched the cultural backgrounds of every attending dignitary, and prepared detailed protocols for everything from greeting customs to gift exchange traditions. Meanwhile, Margaret orchestrated the massive logistical operation with the confidence that comes from knowing your partner has the skills to handle whatever you can't. She coordinated accommodations for 50 executives, managed catering for multiple dietary restrictions, and scheduled transportation that accounted for the varying arrival times of international flights. The night before the summit began, Margaret and Isabella did their final walkthrough of the preparations. Every detail had been considered, every contingency planned for. As they stood in the main conference room, surrounded by the fruits of their collaborative effort, Margaret felt a deep sense of satisfaction. "You know," Margaret said, "a year ago I would have been having panic attacks about now." Isabella laughed. "A year ago I was folding laundry and dreaming about using my education again. It's amazing how much can change when the right opportunities arise." The summit exceeded everyone's expectations. Philippe's investors were impressed not just with the technical presentations, but with the flawless cultural sensitivity displayed throughout the event. The French energy minister complimented Philippe on his sophisticated international operation, while the German delegation praised the efficiency and attention to detail. During the closing dinner, Margaret overheard a conversation that made her realize how far they'd all come. Two executives were discussing Philippe's business operation, and one commented, "Dubois has built something special here. His team understands both the technical and cultural aspects of international business. That's rare in this industry." The other executive nodded. His estate manager and cultural coordinator worked together seamlessly. "You can tell they've created a system that actually enhances his business capabilities, rather than just supporting them." After the last guest departed, Philippe gathered the entire staff for a celebration. He singled out Margaret and Isabella for special recognition. "What you two accomplished over the past month was extraordinary," he said. "But more than that, you've shown me the value of building a team where people's strengths complement each other rather than compete." Philippe paused, looking thoughtful. "I have an announcement. I'm opening a new office in Lyon to manage our European operations, and I want Isabella to head the international coordination from that location. Margaret, I'd like you to consider splitting your time between California and France, overseeing estate operations at both locations." Margaret felt her heart skip. The opportunity to work internationally had always been a dream, but she'd never imagined it becoming reality. "Isabella, Philippe continued. I'm also prepared to sponsor your permanent residency application. Your skills are too valuable to risk losing to visa complications. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. Monsieur Dubois, I don't know what to say. This is beyond anything I could have hoped for. Over the following weeks, as they planned for the international expansion, Margaret reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. She'd started this job convinced that success meant having all the answers and handling every challenge alone. She'd learned that real success came from recognizing what you didn't know and finding the right people to fill those gaps. Isabella had taught her that admitting limitations wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. Margaret had taught Isabella that talent needed opportunity to flourish, and that creating those opportunities was one of the most rewarding aspects of leadership. Their partnership had also changed how Philippe approached business. He'd begun hiring more internationally diverse staff, recognizing that cultural competency was as important as technical skills in global operations. The estate had become a model for international collaboration that impressed his business partners and investors. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the garden of Philippe's new French estate, watching Isabella coordinate a dinner party for European energy executives with the same effortless grace she'd once brought to folding laundry. Margaret was splitting her time between California and France now. Managing Philippe's expanding international operations, she'd also enrolled in intensive French classes, not because she felt inadequate, but because she wanted to better understand the culture that was becoming such an important part of her professional life. Isabella had offered to tutor her, and their lessons had become one of Margaret's favorite parts of her weekly routine. You've come so far, Isabella said one evening as they walked through the vineyard behind the French estate. We've come so far, Margaret corrected. I never could have achieved any of this without learning to recognize talent when I saw it. Isabella smiled. And I never could have achieved this without someone willing to create opportunities for that talent to grow. They'd both learned that the best partnerships aren't built on similar skills, but on complementary strengths and mutual respect. Margaret had discovered that sharing authority actually increased her influence, while Isabella had learned that her cultural background and education were assets to be celebrated rather than hidden. As they watched the sunset over the French countryside, Margaret thought about how different her life might have been if she'd let pride prevent her from asking for help. She'd almost lost her dream job because she couldn't admit what she didn't know. Instead, she'd found something better than she'd ever imagined, a partnership that made both of them more successful than either could have been alone. The estate operations now ran so smoothly that Philippe had recommended their management model to other international executives. Margaret and Isabella had become sought-after consultants for families and businesses struggling with cross-cultural operations. But more than professional success, they'd built a friendship based on mutual respect and shared accomplishments. They'd proven that the best solutions often come from the most unexpected places, and that recognizing hidden talent is one of the most valuable skills any leader can develop. Looking back, Margaret realized that the day she watched Isabella speaking French with Madame Dubois was the day everything changed. Not because Isabella solved her language problems, but because Margaret finally learned that true leadership meant empowering others to succeed rather than struggling to prove she could do everything herself.